On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we look at some tricks and treats from the first month of the season.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team each and every day, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we take a look at the first month of the season for the Wild, and we'll toss out tricks and treats, what has pleasantly surprised so far, and what maybe had us fooled at the opening few games. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021 and credentialed media member. And obviously, it's Halloween. So happy Halloween first and foremost. And of course, I had to get into character here today. One of the few Halloween costumes that I have just laying around. So we, in honor of Freddie Gaudreau's most recent performance, we went Freddie on the bit, as you can see, with the Freddy Krueger getup. So Halloween's one of my favorite times of the year, and so obviously wanted to have a little fun with today's episode by taking a look at some of the areas that have been pleasant surprises so far, a treat, or some things that have maybe started to come back to earth, a trick. And so let's start with some of the tricks so far this season. And I'm going to go right to a guy that we talked about needing to have a big season this year just to help out with the top six scoring. Started off pretty darn good and now has seemingly dropped back into some of those patterns that we saw last year that were frustrating, that led to his numbers being counted on a daily basis. And we had a comment on YouTube saying maybe it's time to bring that back, and so we're dusting off the shot counter, and we'll have that ready to go for tomorrow night if needed. But Marcus Johansson, I'm putting right now in the trick column. Started off fantastic, was really doing a good job of being an active participant and, winning battles along the boards, pushing the play up the ice, and really helping that line with Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson-Ek do some hardcore clicking. But you look over the last few games, especially the Tampa Bay game, the Philly game, and the Pittsburgh game, we're talking now about 2 shots on goal total in that 3-game span. Games before that, the game against the Tampa Bay Lightning, Johansson, or a game against the Florida Panthers, Johansson had a goal, was a +2, had 4 shots on goal in 14 minutes. Before that, against Columbus, it was 3 shots on goal. And the criteria for me is the active participant line, is making sure that you're doing things that can impact the play as opposed to just kind of being out there and being part of a trio, but not necessarily an active participant. Because you look at the numbers right now, what Johansson has done through the first 8 games of the season that he's played, he's on pace for 9 goals, 18 assists, 27 total points in 73 games. That's his current pace. That's not going to cut it. That is not going to cut it for a top 6 spot in the lineup. We gave a little bit of the benefit of the doubt at the start of the year because the overall results, I think, were pretty good. It looked like a different Marcus Johansson, but now we've seen over the last couple of games that we are falling back into those old habits. And as a result, that second line production has started to drop a little bit. So that is going to need to be a part of the lineup that picks up the pace. If Marcus Johansson is going to be a member of that second line, you got to carry your weight. Because I know it's early, but Matt Boldy is on pace for 100 points so far this season, which if he gets there, that's going to be an amazing year. Obviously, it's very early. And Kirill Kaprizov's on pace for 164 points. Those guys are carrying their weight. Somebody is going to need to help Joel Eriksson Ek and Matt Boldy get those numbers up to where they should be so that the top line doesn't have to do everything. So that top combination of Kaprizov-Rossi-Zuccarello, they don't have to do all of the heavy lifting every game. You've got to have a line that can be a perfect complement to that top line. And Joel Eriksson Ek and Matt Boldy can't do it all themselves. So I would imagine we'll see Johansson given an opportunity to try to get back to where he was. But those numbers have come back down to earth a little bit from a really strong start to the season. So I'm putting him in the trick category. I'm also putting the special teams in the trick category, not necessarily for the power play, but I'm still a little concerned about the penalty kill. The Minnesota Wild right now are 7th in the league in power play percentage at 25.8%. They were above 30. The last few games have been a little sloppy on the power play side of things. But I don't worry as much about that group being able to figure it out. I feel like that group of 5 that you have it's got to be up there. It's got to be up there amongst the best in the league in terms of the talent that you have on that group. So I don't worry about the power play really at all. I do have questions about the penalty kill. Minnesota Wild are still the least penalized team in the league with 41 penalty minutes in 9 games. That's tied with the New York Islanders for 31st. Winnipeg is 7 penalty minutes ahead. Wild did have their first fighting major of the season, courtesy of Brock Faber, trying to get into it with Sidney Crosby, which I still love. But the penalty kill sits right now at 70.6%, which is 27th in the league. And as much as being a more disciplined group has helped, at the end of the day, unless you don't commit any penalties, you still have to find ways for that group to be effective. We've talked early in the season about how you have to grade power play and penalty kill on goals scored and goals prevented. It doesn't matter if you do 99% of what you need to do in a 2-minute penalty kill. If the other team scores, that's a failure. And some of the work that we've seen has been promising, but at the end of the day, you need to get that penalty kill up to at least middle of the pack, because this is going to be the MO for teams that play the Wild as the season unfolds. Dallas is going to look to exploit this. St. Louis is going to look to exploit this. These teams that the Wild are going to be jockeying with in the Western Conference, they're going to look to exploit this every time they play the Wild. You get them frustrated, you are probably going to go on the power play. And this played into it against Philly, where Matt Zuccarello late in the game got tangled up and he got frustrated with the fact that the Flyers basically weren't letting him get up off the ice. So there's a huge scrum at the end of the game. And I understand the need to take care of business. I get that. But at the end of that play, the Wild ended up getting called for a penalty themselves. And so instead of having a power play at the end of the game, you have 4-on-4. And you could have had a situation where you are playing 6-on-4 with an empty net as opposed to 5-on-4. And maybe you're able to tie that game up. In the game against Pittsburgh, John Merrill got called for a cross-checking penalty because he took one against the Penguins that did not get called, and so he retaliated. Those are the kinds of things that, to this point, the Wild have been able to avoid. They're not going to go the whole season without avoiding that in mass, but the fact that the Wild have played a much more disciplined style of hockey so far is very encouraging. But we need to start seeing some solid penalty kills strung together. And it's all about these little things that all lead to a successful or unsuccessful kill. Winning faceoffs on the penalty kill and being able to start with a clear to where you can get set up on the blue line and keep teams from getting in behind you, as opposed to having your opponent win the faceoff, then you're on your heels the entire rest of the play. Getting to the puck and getting it cleared, that's an issue at times with this penalty kill unit, is just not being able to get the puck out of the zone, which leads to second and third chances for the opponent. Those are all little detail things. So I'm putting the penalty kill in the trick department for today's episode. It's early enough that you can get some solid footing and get that way higher up, but same story as the last couple of seasons. It's just that the Minnesota Wild are not being penalized nearly as much as they were over the last couple of seasons. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that get picked up a little bit. But those are the main tricks at this point in the season. It's still early in, but we are a month in. And so those are a couple of things that just bear watching. Started off really well, but now have taken on a little bit of water. Let's get to the treats. There have been plenty of treats from the start of the season, and we'll circle in on a few of the biggest as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We will have you covered for tomorrow night's game against the Tampa Bay Lightning with, of course, a live Locked On Wild postcast, as well as a look at what the Lightning bring to the table. So make sure to tune in for that coming up tomorrow as we guide you into the month of November here on Locked On Wild. We talked about the tricks. Let's talk about the treats so far this season for your Minnesota Wild. I'm going to start with the goaltending so far. The Minnesota Wild come in 5th in the league with a 2.56 goals against average as a unit. 6-1-2, a 914 collective save percentage, which is sixth in the league amongst all teams. And the individual stats for both Filip Gustafson and Marc-Andre Fleury are pretty good. We've seen Filip Gustafson, other than the one game against the Philadelphia Flyers, has been just crisp so far this season. 4-1-1, 2.17 goals against average, and a 922 save percentage. He's allowed 13 goals in 6 games, and 6 of those came in the Philly game. So he's been pretty darn good, to say the least, so far this season, but has done just a much better job of being decisive in the net, tracking the puck, moving around in the crease, all these things that we picked up on and have talked about. The everydayers have been mentioning this in the comment section all season. Gustafson has just done a much better job of tracking and having a plan of attack out there, as opposed to reacting to everything that's going on after it happens. 7th in the league right now with a 2.17 goals against average. He is just 5 points behind Connor Hellebuck, and has been just a huge surprise so far this season. 8th in save percentage at 922. Still looking for that first shutout, but we've talked about that as well, that it seems like all of the goals that are given up happen in the third period, where you're up 3 or 4-0 and all of a sudden the other team scores a goal. I'll take that over what we have seen previously, where it seems like you're giving up 1 or 2 goals every single game. So Filip Gustafson's play has been a treat. Marc-Andre Fleury's numbers, 2-0-1, a 2.93 goals against average, an 899 save percentage. And in the first few games that he's played this year, the numbers have been steadily increasing. Played fantastic against the Tampa Bay Lightning with 2 goals allowed against that high-powered offense. He gave up 3 to Pittsburgh. First start of the year against Seattle, had a few that you'd like to see your goalie make the save on, but to his credit, didn't get a ton of help in front of him. Symbiotic relationship between the goalies and the defense. Everydayers have heard me talk about that quite a bit as the season has unfolded. But all in all, the goaltending has been one of the big treats of the season so far. Another treat has been the play of the Kirill Kaprizov, Marco Rossi, and Matt Zuccarello line combination that has really started to gel as the season has gone on. Oh, and by the way, Kirill Kaprizov is second in the NHL in points with 18, tied with Nathan McKinnon. He's behind Cale Makar and Mark Stone, who played, I believe they played last night, which is why they were able to overtake. But Kaprizov was tied for the lead heading into the action last night. 18 points in 9 games. He's making just these otherworldly plays to set up both Zuccarello and Rossi, is benefiting from a lot of attention being drawn his way and making good plays and getting production from the rest of his line consistently. Matt Zuccarello has 5 goals and 9 points in 9 games this season. Marco Rossi's got 8 points in 9 games so far this season. And so that line combination has really helped lead the way for this Minnesota Wild team, a team that has scored 34 goals through 9 games so far, which is about 3.7 goals per game, which is far better than where we've been at in previous seasons. The rest of the 5-on-5 play has been up and down, but that top combination of Kaprizov, Rossi, Zuccarello has done a good amount of heavy lifting for this Minnesota Wild team so far. We talked about the penalty kill as a trick, but I am going to credit the discipline at which this Minnesota Wild team has played so far as a treat. so many times over the last couple of seasons. Just a parade to the penalty box every single game. Through 9 games this year, 41 penalty minutes for the Minnesota Wild. That's it. That's all. The team that is in the top spot amongst NHL teams in terms of penalty minutes, they are far and away ahead. It's still it's actually the Philadelphia Flyers now. So they have overtaken the Utah Hockey Club, who are off to a great start in that department. Although I don't know if that's something that you want to be a leader at. Philadelphia is at 129 penalty minutes in 10 games, 41 for the Minnesota Wild. And that has been something that has been so frustrating over the last couple of seasons, is not playing at 5-on-5 nearly enough. And the Wild, to their credit, have done a much better job of that this season. They're not beating themselves. The amount of time where they make mistakes that lead to opportunities for the opponent is far lower than it's been over the last couple of seasons. So the Wild have done a much better job of focusing on playing disciplined hockey and beating their opponents as opposed to setting themselves up to get beaten by the opponent on a nightly basis. And a treat, 5-1-1 on the road trip. What's not to like about that? There's stuff to clean up for sure. But it's one thing to have things that you can clean up while you're winning games than it is to have things that you can clean up that repeatedly are issues and losses. A big turnaround from what we saw last year compared to this year is the Wild are finding ways to win while also having some things that they can work on and iron out. And last year, it seemed like every mistake that was made led directly to a loss. So that's been a treat so far this season. There are plenty of others. Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson-Ek off to really good starts. Jake Middleton off to a fantastic start to the season. But let's talk about some things that are a little scary as this season unfolds. And it doesn't have as much to do with the Minnesota Wild in general as much as it does with the other teams that are currently just rolling in the Central Division so far. So we'll take a look at the scariest parts of the first month of the season for not only the Minnesota Wild, but the Central Division. That's all on the way as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy. So your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, Prize Picks keeps your lineup live. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. And for your second listen, make sure to check out Locked on NHL. Some big news on the injury front impacting the Central Division, as well as the entirety of the Western Conference. Connor McDavid going to be out for a couple of weeks. What does that do for the Edmonton Oilers' chances of making another deep run in the West? So we'll see how those injuries play out, but Locked on NHL will have you covered every step of the way. So finishing up the show today, we're going to take a look at the teams that are off to the scariest starts so far this season, and it's the two teams that are currently ahead of the Minnesota Wild in the standings, the Winnipeg Jets and the Dallas Stars. Now, on the Wild side of things, the Wild played Winnipeg to start the 7-game road trip without Joel Eriksson, without Jared Spurgeon, and they battled the Jets to a 2-1 loss in overtime. Second night of a back-to-back, absolutely gassed, and the Wild were able to go in and still take a point from the Winnipeg Jets on their ice. Winnipeg scoring at will so far this season. Kyle Connor has 9 goals in 10 games. Mark Scheifele has 6 in 10 games. Nino Niederreiter has 5 goals in 10 games. And you've got 5 different players that are averaging a point per game or better on that Winnipeg team. They've scored 46 goals in 10 games. Their power play, they have 13 power play goals in 10 games. And this is a Winnipeg team that the last couple of seasons has done really well, but it has been pretty heavily relied upon by their defense and their goaltending. Oh, by the way, Connor Hellebuck is 7-1 so far this year with a 2.12 goals against average and a .923 save percentage. Winnipeg is getting every bit of the equation right now. Offense, defense, goaltending, special teams. There's a lot to like about where that Winnipeg team is at so far this season. But if you look at the teams that they've played, up until recently, they started the season against Edmonton. Edmonton is a legit playoff contender. Waxed them 6-0. They beat Chicago 2-1 in overtime. Chicago is hoping that they can be better this year, but they are far from that. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. They beat Minnesota. Minnesota hoping to be a playoff team this year. That was a 2-1 OT win. They beat San Jose 8-3. San Jose is awful. 8-3 is about what that should look like if you're playing that sort of a team. They beat Pittsburgh 6-3. Pittsburgh Penguins, as we just saw, terrible defensively, but still have some weapons. Beat them pretty handily. They went to St. Louis, won 3-2 there. They beat Seattle in Seattle 4-3 in OT. Beat Calgary off to a pleasant start 5-3. Then they got beat by Toronto 6-4. They beat Detroit in their most recent game 6-2. There have been some legitimate contenders mixed in there, but it's been a lot of the teams that you would expect to be able to beat. And now a stretch coming up for the Winnipeg Jets. They play at Columbus tomorrow night, but then they host Tampa Bay, they host Utah, they host Colorado, they host Dallas, and they're on the road at New York, at Tampa Bay, at Florida, and then home against Florida. Then they are at Pittsburgh, at Nashville, at Minnesota, at Los Angeles, and at Vegas to close out the month of November. That's a tough schedule for the Winnipeg Jets. That's going to tell us a lot about if this team is for real or not, or just beating up on opponents that are below them in the standings. I think they're legit, but we will have a great idea as to if they are or not after that November schedule is done, because there are a lot of tough teams in there for them to play. So that's one team that scares me. The Dallas Stars are the other. Dallas Stars, a wealth of depth up and down the lineup. They don't have as flashy of numbers as the Winnipeg Jets did because they just have so many players that can beat you in a bunch of different ways. So here are the players that as of right now have 5 or more points for the Dallas Stars. We'll say 4 or more because Jamie Benn has 4 points right now. Wyatt Johnston, 1 goal, 5 points. Thomas Harley, 1 goal, 5 points. Jason Robertson has 4 goals, 6 total points. Rupe Hintz, 4 goals, 8 total points. Mason Marchment, 2 goals, 8 total points. Tyler Sagan's got 4 and 4. for 8 points. Logan Stankoven, 9 points, just 1 goal so far, but 9 total points in 9 games. Matt Duchene, your leading scorer, with 6 goals and 11 points through the first 9 games of the season. They've only scored 28 goals in the first 9 games, so they're averaging under 3 per game. But Jake Ottinger, 5-1, a 1.84 goals against average, a 938 save percentage. And you go from Scott Wedgwood to Casey DeSmith. He's got a 1.69 goals against average and a 936 save percentage. They have allowed 17 goals in 9 games so far this season. So they are getting good goaltending, good defense that is leading to them being able to not have to play in such high-scoring games. They have only allowed 3 goals or more twice. And it just so happens that that was both of their losses. Actually, they've done it 3 times because they beat Nashville 4-3 to start the season. But they beat Nashville 4-3. They beat the Islanders 3-0, Seattle 2-0, San Jose 3-2 in a shootout. They lost to Washington 3-2, Edmonton 4-1. They beat Buffalo. They lost 4-2. Then they beat Boston 5-2 and Chicago 4-2. And it's the same thing for them. The month of November, they've got some tough games at the beginning with a home and home against Florida. And that is that's actually the international series, I do believe. But a couple of games against the Panthers, and they play Winnipeg, Pittsburgh, Boston, Tampa Bay, Carolina, Colorado, all in the month of November too. Dallas scares me because of the depth. They're not off to a great start offensively, but we know that's going to change. And so Dallas is another team that scares me in the Central Division. Beyond that, Utah got off to a great start, but they're drowning in injuries right now. The St. Louis Blues are incredibly mid. The Colorado Avalanche, I don't know if they are going to be able to get out of their own way. The injuries that they have been dealing with are borderline insurmountable. They had good goaltending for a minute, and now that has started to dry up again. So I don't know. Colorado is very tricky. If they get key pieces back, I will always consider them a threat. And then the Nashville Predators, who we all expected to be one of the best teams in the Central, the pieces have not been clicking so far. They have taken a long time to gel. When they do, I think they'll be fine. But the 2 teams that legitimately scare me are Winnipeg and Dallas. In the Pacific, Vegas is doing their thing. Vancouver is doing their thing. The Los Angeles Kings are off to a better start than what they have done over the last couple of seasons. But none of those teams strike terror. The true meaning of Halloween. None of those teams strike terror into me at this point in the year. The only 2 that I'm really legitimately worried about are Winnipeg and Dallas. And that might be scary too, is that those are the only 2 teams in the Western Conference that are really, really putting themselves out there early on. Credit to Vegas too. 7-3-1 is a good start, and they're scoring a gajillion goals through their first 11 games. So maybe put Vegas in there as well. But other than that, it's pretty wide open so far. So it's there for the taking if the Minnesota Wild continue to handle their business and don't revert to bad habits, old tendencies. Keep it the direction that they are currently headed. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked on Wild. Again, happy Halloween. Enjoy whatever you have planned here this evening, whether it be handing out candy at the door, going trick-or-treating yourself, hitting up a Halloween party, or like me, just throwing on whatever classic horror movie strikes you most and making that your evening plans. Whatever you do, just make sure you have some fun here tonight. And we'll have a couple of fun episodes for you tomorrow. taking a look at the November schedule, handing out the Locked On Wild Player of the Month. All that coming up as we gear up for tomorrow night's game against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.